right.
Hey, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this challenge and for a very interesting topic. Um, I'm new to this website. This is my first debate here, so I'm basically going to let you take the lead and show me the ropes of the format and so on and how this is conducted. Um, and I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion. Yeah, this is a fascinating topic.
It is. So first, let me ask you some questions.
Sure.
Do you have debate experience?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say I have debate experience. I've been around debating for about a decade, give or take. I'm from New Zealand, so slightly different probably from the United States in some way. But I think I think it's fair to assume some level of debate familiarity for me. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I came in here with an American style debate,
Yep.
but I've actually learned quite a bit from a guy named Liam and Ben Hewitt. They're Australian debaters,
Okay. Very
and so I
similar.
assume that y'all would have a lot of similarities to like I think does the Monash Society work in New England or New Zealand as well, or is that just strictly?
That is Australian, but the in terms of a format, it's very similar because
Okay, well
yeah,
then there you go.
yeah,
We mostly here at QallOut, there's dual burdens of proof,
yeah,
and then a lot of these social debates, which is what this is called, is less about competitive debating, unless most debaters want to have a competitive, very fast-paced, ferocious debate. But
yeah,
for the most part, these social debates are trying to elucidate some uh, grand ideas that people can discuss, and I try to do my best to be as entertaining as possible and
right,
try to think about the most knowledge and education in this subject.
yeah,
Specifically, economics is where I like to dabble in. So let's roll into it. So first of all, the Federal Reserve should move to a nominal gross domestic product level targeting. Um, so let's get into right quick what the Federal Reserve does. The Federal Reserve is the United States national money bank system. Just a brief overview of it. Um, Nominal gross domestic product is all of the money spent in a year. A lot of people have some different ideas of what nominal gross domestic product is, but essentially, if you have the equation of exchange, which is MV equals PY is nominal gross domestic product. To get your gross domestic product, you use a GDP deflator and you chop off what was from last year. The difference is not growth, and that's your inflation rate. So I want to give everybody here a warrant and a frame as to why I want to change the Federal Reserve to a nominal gross domestic product level targeting. First of all, in academia, the way that we view monetary policy is much different than what the average person views monetary policy. It's actually very counterintuitive. And for the most part, it's abstract and hard to understand, right? So during the 2008 recession, we seen the United States have low interest rates because there was a there was not enough demand for the money, or there was too much demand for money that was not there. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. And to look at this, we have to think of what happens when interest rates hit real low. Well, when interest rates hit real low, there's actually a deflationary spiral. And what that tells us is that the demand for money is greater than the supply of money, which is why it's going down. So, to get what that means, go back to that equation of exchange that I was talking about. M times V, that's money times the velocity. If you have a lowering of velocity, that means you have a lowering of demand. So, the money supply could be infinite if there's still no change to the velocity of money, then there's going to be no change to the overall output that money has. And one of the problems that happened is that the United States saw a supply shock where we saw 1% growth and roughly 4% inflation in a year. And then the Federal Reserve, due to being scared of inflation, stomped the brakes on the interest rates as well as the market and caused a collapse, which led to the financial crisis. If they had been doing a nominal gross domestic product level target, which I will get into what that is in a moment, they would have not had that problem of stomping on the brakes, trying to tell the market what to do, because the market was already telling the Federal Reserve that inflation rates after the supply shock are going to go back to 1.2%. There's no reason you need to stomp on the brakes, right? And that failure of the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve led to the second biggest financial crisis of the past 100 years. And that's something that we ought to regret. And any movement that we can make to rectify and make sure that those problems do not happen again is a net positive. That's why the Federal Reserve should move to a nominal gross domestic product level target. Now, for those who don't know what a nominal gross domestic product level target is, it's a type of monetary policy that people think give a more stable economy than we currently have. It would replace any bank's current monetary policy, which most of them use inflation targeting. It can be understood as the sum of all spending in the economy, and then total spending can increase either because of price raises, which is inflation, because there's more stuff to go around, economic growth, right? So how would they really do this? So they try to control the money supply so that prices rise on average by 2%. If prices rise by more than or less, and then they kind of fail to do it. So what this level targeting means is, like, I'll give you an analogy. You're on a boat, right? And you have a captain. And the captain's like, all right, so we're shooting for New York. About halfway through, he's like, all right, guys, I'm sorry. We're going to be landing in Boston, because we've had some changes to the winds in our sails, and, you know, the current of the ocean's moving us towards Boston. And you look at the captain and you go, well, why the hell are you not turning the boat to move us towards New York, where we wanted to go? And he tells you that, well, the economy is just doing what the economy has to do. So we're just going to land over in Boston, and when we get off the boat, we'll walk up to New York, which is obviously going to take a lot longer. That's what monetary policy is doing. And nominal gross domestic product level targeting targets a level at, let's say, 5% growth every year. That, let's say that you're at 2% growth, you'll have 3% inflation. Let's say you have 3% growth, you'll have 2% inflation. That way, you're overall averaging 1.5 to 2.5% inflation over a long period of time, versus inflation targeting, where you're undershooting inflation or overshooting inflation, and then you're trying to constantly move next year's target to match what you fucked up last year and try to get 2 years ahead. With that, I will pass it.
Right. So a number of very interesting things that you just brought up. And I think in terms of economic analysis, the only link that I would add possibly is the fact that when inflation is high, that's usually correlated anyway with higher spending, because it means that there's greater pressure on people to preserve the value of the things that they have. And conversely, when inflation is low, that's usually correlated with less spending. So these variables of inflation and nominal GDP do have a link anyway. And so I think from a theoretical perspective, there's people who would argue, keep interest rates consistent or something like that on the grounds that the market will eventually correct. And in the long run, that's true. But the whole point of, having some sort of monetary policy is in order to try and correct those things and try and get the inflation on target. And if the bankers are right in the Reserve Bank, if we assume that they always have perfect knowledge of the future, that would mean that there's more economic certainty, that there's a good mix of stability and growth in the economy. Of course, we know that that's not true, and sometimes bankers get it wrong. And you mentioned a particularly egregious example of that prior to the 2008 financial crisis. And some would argue some of the actions since the 2008 financial crisis have not been the wisest decisions either. But that's the theory behind it anyway, of why we even do this sort of thing in the first place. So it sounds to me like essentially you raised two arguments. One of them was the idea of it being some sort of like stepping on the brakes effect to correct for past decisions, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The more interesting one to me is how you mentioned about how it's easier to understand. And I think that's a really strong sticking point, because one of the most important parts of the whole system is transparency and making sure that everyone does understand. The nominal GDP, in fact, GDP in general, but particularly the nominal GDP, is notoriously hard to measure. So nominal GDP undergoes, I think in the United States it'll be the same. You guys will have 4 measurements of that per year, and it usually undergoes a series of revisions after the fact as more information about inflation and so on becomes known. And so essentially currently what people are doing is they're kind of having to forecast. Nominal GDP might give people a sense that they're doing this on the basis of greater evidence, but it's not really the case, because you're always doing something on the basis of a number that's going to be changing and that has been known to be fairly volatile in the past. Sometimes the nominal GDP has been egregiously wrong. And so you have to bear in mind the fact that nominal GDP isn't necessarily a perfect measure in and of itself. And in addition to that, the fact is that nominal GDP isn't something that people are used to. I mean, in the business community and so on, people are used to having inflationary GDP and having, real GDP, having some sort of a metric that is tied to inflation. And so for them to adjust as well isn't just something that a couple of bankers, it means that the whole have to shift in some way to adapt the way that the Fed is going to be signaling things to them. So in terms of what's abstract and hard to understand, I would say that both are fairly hard to understand, but one is one that we're far more used to in terms of dealing with. In terms of the other one about stepping on the brakes, I would argue that wouldn't be a problem in the first place if people would forecast more accurately. And the fact is, our models are getting more and more accurate all the time. We have big data now that I would argue in 2008 was not available to us. That's not to say that human error and political influences are not going to have a significant effect, and they are. But that goes both ways. And I think one of the most interesting things to me about this topic is that it seems to me that basically whoever advocates this is just going to be whoever's critical of a reserve bank at the time, or a Federal Reserve at the time. And so, in the wake of 2008, it was all the right wingers, like all these market monetarists and so on, who jumped up and said, we need this system because the Reserve Bank got it wrong. And essentially, the swing back of that is that nowadays it seems to me that I'm a liberal, so all of my fellow liberals are saying it now. The reality is it doesn't actually cause that great a correction in the economy. And even if it were adopted, it wouldn't necessarily mean that the Federal Reserve will be making better decisions. It just means that those decisions will be on the basis of less data. It's not looking at inflation anymore. It's just looking at the nominal growth rate. So I don't necessarily see that effect of stepping on the brakes would be any different under the alternative model, because you'd still have all of those influences coming in, those political influences, those other things that might cause a reserve bank to make less than optimal decisions in all of those cases. So yeah, that's the way I see the argument that you just raised. I'm happy to hand it over to you.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there. So first of all, the easy understanding. The reason why I push for that, one, is that we have rational expectations in economics, and that when we can signal, because of the transmission mechanisms, right? than monetary transmission mechanisms. My personal favorite is signaling and portfolio rebalance. Mommy! Okay, good. My child.
That's right.
So I think signaling plays a big part of it, and I think portfolio rebalancing plays a big part of it, and those two are directly affected through the nominal gross domestic product level targeting channel, more so than inflation targeting, and more so in a few other targeting mechanisms. I'm really not going to get into this. There's quite a bunch of them. What I will say is that what we've seen from quantitative easing in 2008 or 2009 to about 2013, we've seen that the portfolio rebalancing channel was actually the biggest transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And that's another reason why I would say that we should go to nominal gross domestic product level targeting. And another thing about that, about saying that the metrics that they use on inflation versus nominal gross domestic product, and how sometimes nominal gross domestic product is egregiously different than other ones. So I want to give an idea of why. So so you've got the Case-Shiller index, and then you've got the BLS's governmental housing data. Okay, go. And with that, I think it was 2011 that Case-Shiller index said that housing prices were down 35%, but the BLS had stated that housing prices were up 10%, right? So that's a 45% swing in two different directions. And if you use one set of inflation like PCE versus PCI, you're going to get a massively different GDP deflator versus using just a strict GDP deflator or nominal gross domestic product deflator without having the addended PCE or PCI or any other inflation. You can use market forecasting inflation, and altogether you'll come by using all of these and giving yourself like a Bayesian analysis, is what I would prefer people to do. You would come to the closest mean, and that would be the best forecasting. But obviously, there is some problems in forecasting because it can't be 100%. But that's why the secondary part to nominal gross domestic product level targeting is that there is a futures market that's built from the Federal Reserve that allows them to target a certain level that the market wants. And I think that also goes into the portfolio rebalance and the signaling channel. All right. Next. Well, I mean, really, that was a lot. So
yeah,
let's talk about interest rates real quick, because you said some things like it would be best if we just had one single interest rate to stay along the line. If we lived in a perfect world, I would actually be a fan of the Friedman rule. For those who don't know, that the Friedman rule is that the interest rate should be zero. And that if the interest rate is zero at all times, inflation and other problems would literally go away. And that you could have 0% inflation, 0% interest rates, and you would have no differences between buyers and savers. Now, obviously, this can't work because we don't live in a perfect world. We do have supply shocks, we do have demand shocks, and we do have, government involvement into the market. So obviously this can't work. But I think the major error right now, and I think you pointed out that this was like the conservative and libertarian right-wing individuals for the market monetarists. Well, I will agree. But the thing about it is nominal gross domestic product level targeting was first created by Tobin, who's a far left economists who come up with some brilliant stuff, right? So I'm an economist. I don't care if you're right wing or left wing. If your metrics are good and your data's sound, then I have nothing to say. I don't care where you land politically, just as long as the policy that you're promoting is going to make a better society. And with that, I'll give it back.
Cool. And I think the most interesting part of it for me, I mean, you mentioned portfolio rebalancing, the futures market, that sort of stuff. That is, of course, part of what the Federal Reserve does. And so, like, their policy, like, it isn't just interest rates. It does encompass all of those things as well. But since this is like a target-based debate, You know, like all of those things are eventually, hopefully, going to conform to whatever the bank sets as its targets. And so all of those are mechanisms as well, but they all support whatever the target is. You also mentioned rational expectations, which I always thought is one of the weirdest theories in economics because it's so misnamed. Like the idea of rational expectations essentially grew out of the fact of stagflation happening, and that was people acting against their own self-interests. So sometimes rational expectations don't necessarily mean that people are going to be acting in a way that means that the economy is going to perform better. Sometimes it means that people are going to try and act in the short-run interests of themselves to the exclusion of much bigger and much more long-term impacts as well. But I think one of the things that I also wanted to bring up is that even in like what you were just saying now, you know, like trying to explain like the mechanisms by which it works, I reckon about maybe 80% of business people that I know wouldn't understand that. They understand inflation. They understand, you know, how prices rise over time because that's something they see every time that they, you know, have to set their prices. But when it comes to things like futures markets and that sort of thing, unless you're actually operating in that industry, that's not a very easy thing to understand, or unless you've studied economics or something like that. And so that means essentially that the transparency is to a great degree lost, that you're not doing something which ordinary business owners can catch onto. It just means that they're going to be increasingly finding it difficult to actually deal with that and to predict what their long run growth is going to be. To a certain extent, I've seen the same argument raised against nominal GDP measures in general, because people say that it's hard to predict what the future sustainable long run growth rate actually is. People saying like, oh, 3%, you were mentioning, you know, 0% could be sustainable in a perfect world, maybe. It's hard to predict what a perfect world would look like. But then, you know, I also think that with this particular thing, we just don't have that sort of evidence available to us. We're using tools that are imperfect on the basis of information that is imperfect and is subject to a lot of future revisions. And it's going out to an economy that isn't going to understand what the Reserve Bank is really doing. And the impact of that is going to be not the sort of savior that, you know, the left and the right wing want to make it out, depending on who's in power at the time. But it's just going to mean that communication and forecasting is going to be so much harder under that system, and you're not really going to get those kinds of things. I would argue that everything that happened up until the 2008 and even during the 2008 financial crisis was all political. It wasn't on the basis, I don't think you can really justify it on either side as economically prudent, or everything that happened anyway. And I think that, you know, that those same forces, as long as they're going to continue to exist, that's going to mean that the Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve, is going to really, really struggle to put any sort of tool in place that is going to help them, you know, create a more reasonable inflation level economy. So that's I guess the problem that I have with what you just said in a nutshell.
No, so I think those are really good concerns, but my only problem with those concerns is that I don't know if anybody here, have you ever read a Federal Reserve report from the FOMC? They're awful.
I mean, I have. Yeah.
Well, so
Yeah,
I was on what's called a Federal Reserve Challenge Team, and what we did is we took the Federal Reserve's FOMC meeting by the numbers, read them, extrapolated, made our own data analysis, and then went in to a room with a person from the Federal Reserve and some local academics and gave what we thought they would say. And it's really difficult. And reading what they put, because the market hangs on every word that they say. I mean, words. There's been small financial hiccups because when they release the FOMC by the numbers to the public, there's like they bring them into a room, and this room is just like everything is cut off. You're not allowed to do anything, and you have one computer, and then they give you this stack of paper of what the FOMC said. They hand it to you, and they say you got 45 minutes to an hour maximum. Write down what you can and post it on your website, and you'll see this in like the Wall Street Journal and places like this. They all have people that go into this room, and there's been some serious problems in the market because somebody from the Wall Street Journal posted out what it said, and they misspelled a couple words, and the people on the other side had took them to mean something else, and so they were like, "Oh, sell, 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 sell," and then they just dropped the bottom out of them because they need to be in a bear market, or they need to be in a buying market. So when it comes to like transparency for the words, I do think that there is a net positive here for nominal gross domestic product level targeting, because at the end of the day, this is what the FOMC meeting is going to be. We're going towards a 5% target. Done. Right? And they don't need to explain the mechanisms any more now than what they do, or they don't need to explain the mechanisms any more later on than what they do now. The mechanisms that we work under for monetary policy, of course, most businessmen don't know that, and they don't need to know that. They just need to know what's going to happen with inflation, and they just need to know what's going to happen with overall growth. And I think that doing this makes it a lot easier because at the beginning of the year, the FOMC says, all right, this is the start of 2018. This year, we are going to hit 5% nominal gross domestic product. That's it. It doesn't matter what happens to growth. We're going to hit 5% nominal gross domestic product. So as the year goes on and we get, okay, so let's say we're projecting 3% gross domestic product growth, then we know that we're going to have 2% inflation. If they're saying 1%, then we're going to have 4%. So at the end of the day, these businessmen, they can make adjustments on the fly, especially now. And because prices aren't nearly as sticky as wages now in this dynamic economy. So it's much easier for them to adjust those. And then when it comes to sticky wages, well, increased inflation and, a demand shock or something like that, they're not going to be as held down as they would be in a inflation targeting regime, where even if they do it perfectly, they're still not going to be able to inflate the economy to the same level, especially when we start moving to the zero lower bound. And I think that's where it is. I think that right now there's several individuals that work for the Fed that want to do a nominal gross domestic product. And I think the way they've said it is that at 7%, unemployment will move to a nominal gross domestic product level target, or 3% increased inflation will move to a nominal gross domestic product level targeting. So we'll have inflation targeting up until it's necessary that we need some big guns. Now, the problem with that is if this is obviously a better mechanism, why not just use it in general, right? Because really, we can't discuss growth rates, right? I think Thomas Piketty in his book Capital in the 21st Century, he talks a lot about growth rates, and at the end of the day, he says he has no idea what the growth rate will be, and that we've got some pessimistic offers that say it's 0.5% for the next 50 years. And then we've got some that say it's going to be anywhere from 4 to 5% if we hit singularity in the next 10 years, or technological singularity for people who don't know. So obviously there could be huge growth, there could be no growth. But what we can say is that we can target nominal gross domestic product at a level every year, and that will keep the augmented expectations of businesses and the individuals at a much greater amount of knowledge versus now inflation targeting, where we tell them that we're going to hit 2%, we might not, we might, depends on how the market does.
Okay, that last bit that you said didn't make a ton of sense to me. So you're saying that you can't predict the growth rate, but you can target nominal GDP.
Yes. So again, I go back to what nominal
So
GDP is. It's that
yeah,
right side of the equation, P times Y. So we don't.
surely in order to calculate nominal GDP, you have to take out inflation.
Right, but you
So
would
you
do.
have to have some idea of what the rate was. Right.
Yeah, that's where I talked about earlier about a GDP deflator or using the Bayesian
Right.
analysis of all the other.
Yeah.
I'm saying like for 5,
Right.
10
So
years
you have
down
to
the
have
road.
some idea, is my point. You know, and I look. I mean, I think it's really interesting that you have um you have different models with how you can work with this. I mean, yeah, sure. Like saying like we're going to have 5% growth in the next year is attractive in the sense of how it might be initially communicated to the press, but in terms of how that goes out to the public, that doesn't tell you anything about inflation. It tells you absolutely nothing. It tells you what the Reserve Bank wants growth to be, but it doesn't mean that they'll achieve that. It doesn't necessarily even mean that it's realistic. I think that with the kinds of information that is going to be most useful to businesses, it's probably not some number that's the same every year. It's probably going to be what's happening in the economy right now and what is the government going to do to try and correct for what's going wrong and make use of what's going right. That's the sort of information that people want. And it's sometimes very difficult to communicate all those kinds of things in very, very simple terms. That's why the Federal Reserve has all that information, is because they are, putting out to the press a lot of really complicated information for people to make sense of. The reality is this is a very complicated thing. There's a lot of things to worry about in the economy, and there's a lot of tools that the Federal Reserve uses to deal with that. So I don't necessarily see that as being more attractive. I think that just means that although it is perhaps a more easy job for the Fed, it means that everyone else is going to be having a much harder job deciphering what this actually means in practice. That's just going to be a shift. I mean, like you can imagine if the economy was built up from scratch using this sort of model, it could work. And it wouldn't necessarily be better. It would work, right? But the problem is that because we've set the economy up in this way, we are relying on forecasts that are doing what they do. That just means that they are going to struggle with that sort of thing and struggle to adapt, and it's going to be bad in the short run anyway for the economy. In terms of dealing with a target inflation, target growth rate, and that sort of thing, yeah, nobody really knows those things. I would argue that the same is true of long run nominal growth rates. Nobody really knows what they're going to be like. And so whatever number you set as your target is going to be very, very significant. And it's very arbitrary often. And the same thing is true to a lesser extent of inflation, because with inflation, you can certainly look at a lot of past data and see how the economy has moved. And when you change all your metrics around and deal with that, you're essentially dealing with a lot less data points. And that makes it more difficult to predict anything. So I think in general, that just means that, the Federal Reserve is going to be less able to have tools at their disposal to move the economy. They're going to be less able to target the sort of variables they're used to targeting. And it just means that the whole system is going to be less flexible in terms of the tools that they use to approach these kinds of things. But that's not to say that you're completely wrong. I mean, what you're saying is correct in that it is possible to forecast those kinds of things in that way. I just don't think that it's any less abstract. It's just going to be a really, really huge shift, but it's not going to provide a net positive in the end. In the end, it's just going to mean that people are going to be forecasting on the basis of slightly different variables, which, I mean, you argue they're hard to predict. I would argue that the alternative is also very hard to predict. And I would say that the general public are going to be mildly less informed by this. So I don't really see that net positive actually accruing in practice.
Okay, So I want to talk about tools real quick,
Yeah.
and the tools that the Federal Reserve is going to use. So the first thing I want to state is that based on Ben Bernanke's vector autoregression, structural vector autoregression of monetary policy in our day-to-day lives, short-run fluctuations of monetary policy make up about anywhere from 15 to 25% of total change in an economy. So it's not the biggest mover in economy. And some would even say that it's actually insignificant compared to other. Like purely from a business cycle standpoint, monetary policy is mostly moot. Which is why in most models up until 2008, they didn't care about money in the model. It's only recently in 2012 to 2017 do you start seeing money in and out money and multiplier effects built into your average dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. So I get what you're saying, but the problem is that when it comes to the tools, all the tools that we would do are still available under nominal gross domestic product level targeting, right? So let's say we hit the zero lower bound. Quantitative easing is still available at that. In fact, it's probably easier because you'll already have that high inflation and you can pump the reserves, right? So that's my intuition pump for that one, is that you can do both. Secondly, when it comes to dealing with demand shocks, I mean, obviously raising the inflation rate is the best way to deal with the demand shocks. And I talked about, sticky wages earlier and how higher demand or higher inflation allows you to get past sticky wages much easier. Obviously, you cannot get through them all the way or they wouldn't be a problem, but it does make it easier. And then lastly, when it comes to supply shocks, it doesn't matter what monetary policy does. You cannot stop a supply shock. All you can do is make the burden on the economy easier. And I think nominal gross domestic product level targeting makes it easier on average people during supply shocks because, again, it goes back to those sticky wages and that those wages will be able to keep pace with the inflation of that supply shock good if there is a negative impact to the real growth of the economy. And then lastly, the last thing I want everyone to take away is why we should move to it, because obviously I think all of those is that when we talk about the changing of targets and variables and how the Federal Reserve is actually going to have to change, the Federal Reserve has gone through two changes in the past 20 years to their overall targeting. Ben Bernanke is why they moved to inflation targeting. Other countries were already doing it, but Ben Bernanke got the United States to start doing inflation targeting. And not only was it a positive, it had led to Ben Bernanke being able to use quantitative easing. If Ben Bernanke at the time had moved to a nominal gross domestic product level targeting, we'd have still had that quantitative easing, and there'd have been no more change for the Federal Reserve and the FOMC looking at the variables than it was then. The only addition that we have is an extra variable looking at possible level targeting forecasts, which you don't even necessarily have to have that. We can just say that, again, I'm not arguing that it should be 5% target, that it should be some nominal gross domestic product level targeting. Obviously, historical trends is 3% growth and 2% inflation's the optimal policy that we have in the United States. I'm not 100% sure on others because, you got like the explosions of 1950s, 1970s of the European countries. So anyway, but what I'm saying is that having that target allows the Federal Reserve more room to work their tools that they already have. And plus, it also allows them to better work with monetary aggregates, something I should have brought up earlier. But overall, I'm going to give you the last 5 minutes. I'm really happy to see you here on QallOut. I think you're going to be exceptionally good. I hope you're in the December tournament or the January, December, end of year, super big tournament. And I can tell already that you're going to do phenomenal. And thank you so much for joining me on QallOut.com.
Thank you very much, and it's been an honor. I have to say, in the past, my economics knowledge has not necessarily taken me very far in the world of debating, largely because the vast majority of debaters are not economists. And it's really great actually to be able to debate against you. And obviously this is something that you're very passionate about, and I've taken a lot away from the things that you have said. I think in terms of the debate itself, I think the big issue in this debate that we've discussed is whether the alternative model that you've proposed of having a nominal GDP level target is going to be more easy for people to understand. And I think underneath that, we've had a number of points about whether it's actually going to be better for the economy, but for some reason that's sort of like been a lesser issue in this debate. So, I mean, just now you mentioned that the tools in terms of those very marginal, and that there's not going to be a huge amount of an effect. I think you mentioned 15% or something like that, and that everything is still going to be possible. And all that is true, but I think all that just lessens the impact of the change. And, you know, it just means that the change is going to be some really, really small change in terms of like the economic effect. And you contrast that with like the fervor with which people argue for this kind of thing when the Federal Reserve isn't doing what their side wants them to do. That's what this is really about. It's just about two different sides having two different economic views, and they just, you know, argue for the one which is bigger for them at the time. And so I think, you know, like a lot of this comes to a head with things like you mentioned right at the end that it should be some level. Well, liberals and conservatives, I will tell you now, are going to disagree on what that level exactly should look like. And it means that, you know, there's going to be, you know, some level of, you know, argument anyway. There's going to be political influence. There's going to be all kinds of negative things that are going to happen either way in the economy. And that's what causes, you know, all of these kinds of disruptions. It's not some, you know, difference in forecasting tool, which, you know, people might interpret in a slightly different way. It's literally just that. It's literally just the other side, you know, like looking at, you know, the same numbers in a slightly different perspective. And that's the sort of thing that, you know, is not going to be solved by this kind of model. And that's, you know, the major benefit that you brought up in this debate. You mentioned about like sticky wages and stuff, and I wish I, you know, talked about that earlier, because I think like to a certain extent, the things that are the tools that can be used by the Federal Reserve are pretty much the only tools that in any way actually affect the stickiness of wages. But without, you know, with only 2 minutes left, I don't think it's worthwhile me going over that. I think the ultimate biggest impact in this debate is going to be on how easy it is to understand. And in terms of that, all I can really say at the end of this debate is that everything that makes nominal GDP work is the stuff of high-level economics. And I say this as, you know, somebody, I come from the country that pioneered inflation targeting. And this is the reason why we haven't moved, you know, to a nominal GDP system. And I suspect the same is probably true of the United States as well, is that from the perspective of most economists, and I would consider myself among them, it's a really, really, really tricky model to understand. And it relies on more than just a single number. It relies on that number trickling down to all sorts of other things in the economy, like the sort of measures that you've mentioned in this debate. And, you know, I think because of that, you know, it's interesting to me, we've had this long discussion, got about a minute left. We see it eye to eye on a lot of like how the Federal Reserve works, you know, and like how these kinds of things work. But the difference is that I would prefer something that's known, tried, battle tested, and stable, rather than something that is potentially a little bit out there and might work, but it also carries with it a lot of risks and a lot of misunderstandings, I think. So with that being said, thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. And yeah, I'm not in the tournament, but I hope to have time to do more debates because that's basically the big pressure I have. So thank you very much for welcoming me, and yeah, look forward to seeing you around.
All right, same to you. You have a great one, sir. Have a good one.
All right, see ya.